All right, so this month's book is called Stolen Focus, and the author is Johann Hari. I'm familiar with him because he wrote another book in 2018 called Lost Connections that caused a bit of a stir, especially for psychiatrists and mental health professionals, because it was all about, if you remember, there was this big article that came out. It was based on a research paper kind of suggesting that antidepressant medications, SSRIs, are really not much more effective or questionably at all more effective than placebo. And so the question was like, what are we doing? Like, why are so many people worldwide on these drugs? Do they really work? And Johanna was just really impressed in reading that book with the way he does research and the way his mind thinks about problems and really tries to understand at from all different angles and asking lots of different people's perspectives. In that book, what I remember is he gave the example of a farmer in Africa who was really depressed, and when they gave him a cow so that he was able to function again and do what he loved to do, which was farm, his depression got better. And he really translated that into, why don't we think about this? Why don't psychiatrists, when they're assessing a patient, ask, what is it that you really love to do? And then help them do that thing rather than just collecting symptoms, saying, yeah, you have depression, and handing over a prescription for pills. And that really struck home with me because that's very aligned with the way that I like to practice medicine and psychiatry, which is looking at a whole person and every aspect of your life and figuring out, why might you be feeling this way? The biological model of psychiatry has veered from that and just said, okay, you have a bad brain, sucks to be you need a prescription. And I think the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. There are people who genetically are predetermined to suffer from depression or other mental health problems, and those people definitely deserve and should get treatment with medications that help them. But then there are many of us who are really not living our lives in a way that is healthy or aligned with what we really want to be doing and our purpose. And that can lead to a lot of mental distress symptoms too, which sometimes inappropriately are labeled as mental illness and treated with medications. So this book is about the rising rates of ADHD and his personal feeling that he can no longer pay attention and his frustration with being distracted all the time. Let me just make sure that I've gone live here. Did I? Oh, no, I didn't go live. All right. So hopefully now I am live on Facebook too. Anyway, so this book is about, is it our problem? And he talks about how, a lot of companies want us to think that it's our problem, our lack of discipline, our lack of willpower, that we are guilty of just wasting time and scrolling too much and spending too much time online. But is that really true? Is that the whole story? And he dives into it in a very thoughtful way. And I think this is really important and relevant to us, although it's not a parenting book, because we are raising kids who are in the digital age, who have had access to devices from a young age, iPads, smartphones, computers. And it's on us to be able to teach them and have conversations with them to be thoughtful about, like, how can we manage our attention? And I always come back to, one of our first book clubs was the book 7 Habits of Highly Effective Families. And Stephen Covey, the author of that book, talks about our circle of control versus our circle of concern. So the circle of concern is everything we worry about. We worry about the fact that smartphones are distracting us and our attention spans are getting shorter. And that can make us feel despair and hopeless. I don't want you to feel despairing or hopeless after listening to this. I want you to be focused on your circle of control and to have some ideas about things that you can practically do and teach your kids to do to preserve their focus and to preserve your own focus. So if you are not yet on the list, if you're just coming in live to Zoom with Dr. Marissa, please go to theparentdoctor.com/book club to sign up so that you get the replays and access to the portal where all of the past book club replays are located and all the actionable PDFs that I make for each book. And if you're not listening, please go to the Parent Doctor podcast, like and rate the podcast if you are interested in to listen to podcasts. And I have a monthly office hours meeting where if you are a parent with concerns about your own parental wellness or about your kids' well-being, you can hop in here, pick my brain. I talk each month about different topics. This month was actually about dopamine detox in light of this book, because it really got me thinking about all of the dopamine that we get from our screens and different things that we do online. And we pick a different topic. I talk a little bit, but if people are there with questions, we dive into those questions as well. That happens the second Fridays at 10 a.m. Pacific. And you can go to theparentdoctor.com/office-hours to sign up for that. So in the beginning of the book, he talks about the default mode network. This is a part of the brain that was discovered to be active in the 1980s through imaging research. And we used to think that when you're just sitting around and not focused, your brain is just dormant. It's just resting. And that's actually not at all true. Excuse me, I have a little tickle. When we are not distracting ourselves with screens, which is happening less and less often, when we're just being and just not thinking actively about anything, but letting our mind kind of wander, there actually are certain pathways in our brain that are very active. And they're important pathways because they activate during rest, tends to involve changes in brainwave patterns that can also be seen on EEG. So you get into that alpha state or theta state. It's also what we activate when we get into an intentional meditative state or upon awakening from a nap or from waking up after sleep. So all of this stuff basically gets your brain firing and syncing together in ways that it doesn't normally do when you're asleep or when you're awake and doing stuff, whether that stuff is work or online stuff. An active awake brain is different than a kind of wandering at rest brain. And this basically is important to think about our brain as having these three states of being and realizing that most of us spend very little time kind of cultivating that third state of being. And it's very important for creativity and connectivity between different brain regions that otherwise won't connect with each other. And we'll talk more about why this is so important. But basically, our mind needs to feel, well, our brain and our body needs to feel safe enough to allow mind wandering to happen. So if we are living in a constant state of arousal and fear and anxiety and threat perception, which is part of the problem with our modern social media world and everything that we get fed online, then it's really hard to allow your guard to be down enough to even allow that mind wandering state to happen. But it's super important for your overall well-being, your cognitive functioning, your reducing your risk of anxiety and depression. Your sleep is going to be better and your overall health is going to be better if you do things to foster this default mode network activation through walking without distractions, without listening to podcasts, going out into nature, meditating, breathing, just taking time for yourself. So then he dives into, and this is really like one of many things about this book that really got me fired up, how tech manipulates us. And I think we've all known this. I know at least in my network, people joke about, oh, our phones are listening to us. And you feel like maybe you talk about something with a friend and the next thing you know, you're seeing an ad for that thing on your Facebook feed or in Google and wondering, are they actually listening to me? But I've always brushed that off as, oh no, that's crazy. What he says is they're not actually listening. They probably could be. Maybe they are now. The book's not that old though. But what he said is that essentially everything you do online is tracked. And so there's all these things that we don't even necessarily know are happening, all these cookies and ways that they know where we're spending time online. And that data essentially becomes, when you multiply it with AI against the billions of people in the world, something that allows big tech companies to know you better than you know yourself. So he said the real true answer is scarier than that they're listening to you. It's that they know what people like you do, what they buy, what they go to next, better than you know yourself. So when you see that ad for a trip to Cancun after talking to a friend about going to Cancun, it's not that they were listening to you. It's that they know people who bought the stuff that you bought on these places and went to these websites and hang with this circle on Facebook, go to Cancun. And they actually call it like a digital voodoo doll and essentially say that there are billions of these now in existence. And so this is scary to me because I don't think there's really a way to escape this, right? For us and for our children. If you're going to live in the modern world and not go live off grid in the woods somewhere, then you're going to have a digital footprint that's going to follow you. And allow companies to advertise to you in extremely effective ways because they know what people like you like and buy. And this also leads to engagement being ultimately what companies want. They want our eyeballs just as much as our dollars because our eyeballs lead to our dollars. And the algorithms, which are essentially, they're not evil. When I read this book, I was like, that's terrible. But no, I can totally see how it happened. They're designed to get the results which they get, which is like, how do we get people to stay in this app, on this platform, on this website longer? And because our brains have an inherent negativity bias, meaning we're hardwired to be on the lookout for things that are threatening to us or our way of thinking. So because of that, and we'll get to this in a minute, the algorithm just feeds us more of what we seem to want, but it's not what's good for us. It's not what we really intellectually want, but it's what our brains are always on the lookout for, and therefore where our attention tends to go. So ultimately, we become the product in what he calls surveillance capitalism. And this is a huge shift, which has happened within my lifetime, right? Where things have gone from an ad in a newspaper or a magazine or on a television screen that wasn't directed just to me, but to everybody who bought that thing, to now being an ad that is directed to just me, just my digital voodoo doll and the people like me. So it's pretty scary, right? Because everything becomes that much more effective at getting the potential market to act in the way that they want you to act, whether that's click and buy this thing or do this thing. Essentially, it gives the advertisers a lot more power to influence our behavior. So I like this saying, like, if something's free, it's your attention that's the price. And I talk to my kids about this a lot because I don't pay for games on the iPad. They don't get that much iPad time, but like I don't buy them games, and I certainly don't buy the Robux and the thing like the dollars that you have to invest into the game to buy the stuff in the virtual world. I tell them like, I will give you this free game, but if you ask me for any money, I will remove the game and you won't be able to play it anymore. But it's important that I let them know if the game is free, it's free because your attention is the price. And the free games usually have ads, right? Because they want you to get other things. They're trying to suck you into their vortex. So again, it is what it is. I think we can use it as parents as the opportunity to teach our kids and be aware of this because no one likes being manipulated, kids especially. And so if you can get them to see like you're being manipulated here, then you don't have to be the bad guy so much who's saying, no, you can't have the iPad. They can be hopefully encouraged to make the choice for themselves to decide, I don't want that. I don't want to be manipulated in that way, or to at least be aware of it so that they can turn it off at a certain point and self-regulate, which is ultimately my goal with my kids. I don't want them to never have access to tech because I think that they have to be able to navigate tech in their lives and be able to moderate its use. But they need to be aware of what their attention, how their attention is being manipulated. Okay, so you know that Natalie Merchant song, like, hey, give them what they want. This is what I was reminded of in thinking about this. As I was saying, our brains have a negativity bias, and we are always, our amygdala, the fear center of our brain, is always ready to jump in the driver's seat and take over how we think, what we do, what we say. It's by default going to be the driver of our actions and our thoughts and our behaviors because we want to survive. So that part of our brain is the strongest because it's trying to keep us alive. It's for a good reason. We don't want to get rid of it entirely. We need it. At the same time, when you put a human brain into something that's driving an algorithm, what you end up getting is a strong negativity bias. What this looks like is on YouTube, words like hate, destroys, slams in the title dramatically boost the amount that your video gets promoted by the algorithm. So what that means on a global scale with billions of viewers and millions of videos being posted every day is that negativity goes up. And a scary thing is he said, like white nationalists, white supremacists, many of them reported that they got into this world and this way of thinking by algorithms, especially YouTube algorithms. And there's actually a book my friend recommended to me. I forget what it's called. I think it's called Wellness, ironically, but it was about this idea, like a family's patriarch, like the father got drawn into white nationalism by algorithms on Facebook and YouTube, and the family was just distressed by it. But this is happening, right? And then there was that movie Adolescence that just came out and made a big splash about a young boy who murders a girl based on hatred towards women that he learned online. I haven't actually seen it, but that's what I read about the summary. So then similarly on Twitter, which is now X, retweets, I've never been on Twitter actually, but retweets increase 20% when you use words like attack, bad, or blame. So again, that negativity bias when we're reading a feed makes us go to the thing that seems like a threat, hate, destroy, slam, attack, bad, blame, and then think, oh, I have to let everybody else know about this. So it leads to promotion. And then the algorithm, again, because it's neutral, it's just a computer saying, what do people share? Says, oh, people share this thing. And then that becomes the thing that gets shared. So the ultimate end result is that the more enraging something is online, the more engaging it is. And that means more time spent, and that means more profit. So when you think about what this does to our world, it's really scary and how it changes things. And it's not in our heads that we feel like people have gotten more irate, more irritable, more angry, more polarized. It's really happening. And it's happening because of the way technology is programmed to promote things. So the problem here is that it turns hate into a habit. And these algorithm triggers, as I said, the platforms, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all these things, like it bombards us increasingly with extreme content to keep us engaged. So if you're getting distracted, it's going to give you something more extreme to pull you back in. That's how it works. And our brains then adapt because regular exposure to rage-inducing content basically it like promotes a new normal. Like we feel like we need to feel that kind of outrage to feel alive. And if you feel unsafe, chronically unsafe, it becomes harder to let yourself get back to that default mode network of just being at ease, at peace, and letting your alpha waves play around in your brain. Because again, you can't let your guard down when there's so much to be afraid of and enraged about. It would be irresponsible and dangerous to do that. So we get drawn in, and then there's this habitual response. So in that sense, then some people, not everyone, can begin to seek outrage even offline, perpetuating cycles of negative thinking. And that leads also to fake news. And we all know that this has been a major problem for years and years now. The velocity of fake news, and they can track this on platforms like Twitter and YouTube, is 6 times faster than the velocity of regular news. And even major reputable news channels like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, they are also, I'm noticing, becoming more extreme in their headlines. And I think it's because to get our attention, to be on par with the negativity that is grabbing our attention from other platforms, they have to be, this is destroying this, and this is whatever. They have to be extreme in their language. I had a recent experience where we had travel planned to Mexico, and it was right around that week that Trump's tariffs got introduced. And I saw something on social media that looked like a CNN clip of like thousands and thousands of people stuck in an airport and thousands of people stuck at the border saying that Mexico had implemented a new visa requirement, and all these Americans were like not able to get back into the US or not able to get through to Mexico, which seemed fairly plausible given that the tariffs had gone into effect. And I was like, maybe Mexico didn't like it, and so they're instituting this new visa as like retaliation or outrage. So then I'm like searching online for, are there new visa requirements? And on the Mexico website, it says no. And there was something on, what is it, Snopes that said, no, that's not true. But I almost canceled my trip because I also had a voice in my head saying, maybe though it's so new that Mexico's government hasn't been able to update their website. We ended up going, there was no problem. It was fake news, but you've probably also been victim of fake news at some point, and it's easy to have it happen. Because again, our brains, if we get information from a source that we otherwise trust, our guard is down, and we're likely to just let that in and assume that it's true. And so that's the danger here, is like it becomes increasingly hard to know what's real, what's not real, what is a real true threat and what's not. And our attention just gets hijacked because outrageous content captures more of our focus, and the algorithms therefore promote it more effectively than nuanced truth and thoughtful conversations. That, what is that movie? Was it George Clooney movie about these news guys? It was probably in the 90s. But it was like in the 60s, I feel like there were all these news shows. Not that I was alive in the 60s, but I've seen them. Walter Cronkite and all these people had like thoughtful debates about both sides. People could have different opinions, but really talk through them. And I feel like we have lost that ability in 2025 to a large extent. And so I think this is, again, part of the end result of having our outrage constantly sparked. So then he talks about something called cruel optimism. And that is basically saying that, I think it's better explained here. Like the problem is self-help solutions, like things saying that we should be optimistic because we can make it better for ourselves, ignore the systemic issues and say that it's just a willpower issue, or it's just we're not putting the screen limits that we should on ourselves, or we're spending too much time online. So it's almost like blaming the victim. But again, our neural pathways, because we're designed to survive and look out for any threats to our survival, we pay more attention to things that sound dangerous or threatening. That results to the algorithms promoting those things more. That results in us being more hypervigilant and aware, which leads to cooperation breakdown. It becomes hard to build trust and to cooperate with others and to be thoughtful about problems that require long-term attention and collaborative problem solving when our threat level is high and we're perceiving threats everywhere, because that's just not when we're most cooperative or most thoughtful. And that also leads to attention fragmentation. So he talks in the book about how when we're stressed, IQ can drop 10 to 13 points. The same individual tested at 2 different times can have a significant drop. A standard deviation in IQ is 15 points. It's significant. So a 10 to 13 point drop is huge. And so when you think about what that does societally, when huge groups of people are feeling threatened, it's incredible the negative impact that would have. And it leads to solution paralysis. So I know all this is probably making you feel like, oh, no, this is horrible. My circle of concern is like raining, falling apart around me. There is hope. There is hope that he leaves us with at the end. So don't feel hopeless. The solution is that like real change requires both the self-help part, yes, setting limits for yourself, doing our part as parents, like talking to our kids about these things and walking the walk, leading by example. But it's also going to involve collective societal change. And we have to acknowledge our individual responsibility in promoting and provoking that change by being loud and asking for the changes. So the scariest part of this book for me, the part that just made me go, oh my God, is that this guy, Asa Raskin, and in the book, he talks about 2 youngish guys who worked for Google in Silicon Valley. Asa Raskin was one of them. Asa Raskin's father worked for Steve Jobs, was also like a software developer. And Asa, when he was like 10 years old, became like a STEM coding genius. So he was really like born into the right family at the right time and raised in the ranks of Google, wanting to get more eyeballs. And that's what everybody was all about. And he invented infinite scroll. So if you're old like me, you remember back in the day when the internet used to just, you would get to the end of a page and that was it. Then you had to pick a new page to go to. It didn't just keep going forever. But he invented infinite scroll, which now is on Google, is on YouTube, is on social media feeds, is everywhere. I don't know if Netflix is quite infinite scroll, but it's almost there, right? It's just the idea that like you just keep going and it just keeps feeding you more. He invented that, and it was a huge boom for Google in terms of getting more people's eyeballs, getting more time on there. It was so valuable to all these tech companies. Why? Because conservatively, we spend 50% more time on a site or an app when there's an infinite scroll. That's the conservative estimate. But then at some point, he became very sobered when he realized, in looking around at the world and seeing people distracted all the time and constantly scrolling on their phones, what have I done? And he did the calculation based on the number of people in the world, estimating just a 50% increased amount of time, knowing that the average person in America spends 4.5 hours on screen on their phones per day, that 200,000 human lifetimes from birth to death are lost every day worldwide by the time that we spend just because of infinite scroll. That's just like the kind of excess time, which is crazy. Like that just made me Like, I still haven't quite gotten my head around that. When you think about the societal cost, there certainly is benefit to technology, no doubt, right? But if we're losing 200,000 human lifetimes per day in distraction, I don't know. That's a very high cost, it would seem to me. Just at more numbers that are astounding. Globally, 5 billion hours a month are spent scrolling on Facebook. And the average person, found different studies about this, but checks their phone 144 to 204 times per day. The number of touches, like taps and swipes and everything on the phone, 9 years ago was over 2,600 swipes or taps a day. And if you know a young person, a teenager, and you watch them, I think these numbers are way higher for kids in the 12 to 18 age range. So this industrial scale attention deletion really, when you think about it, limits our ability to solve complex societal problems like housing crises, like global warming, like environmental problems, because those things require us to have sustained attention over a long period of time. And if we're constantly distracted, it's tough. So he talks about like the potential for deeper solutions. And this is where it started to finally become hopeful, although it does require some major shifts that I don't know how they're going to happen, but I have faith that they will happen. One is it would be very easy for tech companies to intentionally change some things to make the platforms less attention grabbing, less sticky. I actually had an Apple Watch for years, like one of the first ones. And everybody loved their Apple Watch. And I wanted to love my Apple Watch, but honestly, it drove me nuts. I never figured out that you could turn the notifications off. So every time I got a text, an email, any app, whatever, I didn't know for years how to turn off notifications in my phone. I'm embarrassed to say that, but I didn't know. And I think a lot of people are in the same boat. Why? It's because they don't make it easy. You have to go into settings, scroll down to notifications, and then every app has a different toggle button, sometimes multiple toggle buttons that you have to turn off if you don't want to get notifications from that app. Now they've made it a little easier, and Apple has it so that you can make all your notifications batched to come once or twice a day, which is nice. If you don't know that, you should definitely do that. But if your phone is like constantly bombarding you, I still remember one time, like just at 2 a.m. or something, my phone was like giving me a notice from Costco about some sale. And I was like, what has happened? But if your phone is doing that, like you need to spend some time. This video is not going to tell you how to do that, but go on YouTube if you need to and find out like, how do I turn off my notification? I personally think you should turn off all your notifications. You can set it up so that family members can still reach you. You should also use the do not disturb function on your phone as much as possible. And then he talks about the fact that companies could collectively decide to eliminate the infinite scroll. I don't know if that's going to happen. I feel like they would have to collectively decide to do that because I can't imagine Instagram and Facebook doing it, but YouTube not, or something like that. Like they would have to collectively agree that they're going to stop that. And then he also suggests, and this is again a big lift, a big ask, that instead of being incentivized by constant corporate growth, which requires constant increase grabbing of our attention so that they're getting more money and the time on their platform becomes more valuable, these companies could become publicly owned companies like the BBC in Britain. And that would prioritize our well-being over profits. That's probably going to be something that requires a big government shift and intervention. And then he also says these could become subscription model where we're paying to have a membership to Instagram or Facebook. Then instead of the price tag being our attention, it becomes our wallet. And therefore, it would be easier for those companies to still exist financially and make money for their shareholders without needing to keep us on there with all these manipulative ways. So this is, again, something that was of a great interest to me as a psychiatrist. So he gives the example of all the things that negatively impact our attention, including stress and childhood trauma. He talks a lot in there about the rising rates of ADHD and how we really need to be thoughtful about the diagnosis of ADHD and consider kids and their whole situation in life, at home, at school, because when you have a situation where your life is traumatic in some way. And he gives examples of a kid whose father just got incarcerated and is now going to be away, and then they're getting evicted, and then the kid gets diagnosed with ADHD. Was it ADHD, or is it the fact that like the parent left to care for these children is extremely stressed and they're financially stressed? And he gives another example of a study of farmers in India where they were tested for IQ before their sugarcane harvest when they were financially more stressed, and then after the harvest when they were financially more secure. And they found a bump of 13 IQ points. Again, 15 is a standard deviation. It's almost a full standard deviation increase in IQ once they were financially secure. And then he talks about experiments that have been done in various countries like Finland, where universal basic income has been given to people. And then they've also studied attention and seen dramatic improvement in attention. Because again, if you're worried about your basic needs, your survival brain can't turn off. You can't expect someone who's hungry or homeless or doesn't know where their next meal is coming from or can't put gas in their tank to get to work to be able to be using their default mode network a lot of the time, which is required to have the ability to maintain sustained attention. They can't because they're in survival mode. So all of these things that contribute to stress also contribute to reduced attention. Another thing he showed, which I think I've read this before, but it was still shocking to see all the data in one place, are all the experiments that have been done reducing people from a 5-day work week in the modern world to a 4-day work week. And not the 4-day work week that I know as a physician, where some people would work 40 hours in 4 days instead of 40 hours in 5 days, but a 4-day work week, 32 hours instead of 40 hours. And when this is done with thoughtfulness and preparation and telling the employees of a company, like, we're going to do this experiment for 3 months, for 6 months, we want you to think about all the things you do and how you can do them in more efficient ways to prepare. And then we're going to judge our productivity as it's been for the last 6 months, and then how it is during the 6-month trial, so that the employees are incentivized to be just as productive with their 32 hours as they were with their 40 hours. What they found is that often, surprisingly, there's actually an increase in productivity because the workers are so excited to be getting more time back to live their lives that they are incentivized to be really thoughtful and engaged and think about this as almost a business owner, like, how can I make my time at work more valuable to the company and problem solve better? And again, so like you reduce the stress and you improve the productivity. And I feel like this is also something that needs to be brought to kids. Like, homework for children has been dramatically on the rise in the last few years, and their stress level is higher than ever. Their suicide rates are higher than ever. Why? Because we're like trying to get them to perform better on tests. But really, I think less is more. I think if we could get them to work less, have less homework, play more, they would probably be more productive. And he discusses this in the book too. He gives some extreme examples of a school in Massachusetts where they essentially just let the kids play. They don't have any curriculum. They don't have teachers. There are adults there who can be used by the kids if they want to, but they literally just let the kids be free reign. It's like the most extreme example I've heard of unschooling. But then he also talks about Finland, where they have some of the most, they have the lowest rates of ADHD. They have really high academic achievement in their kids. They have very high happiness rates. And they really encourage their kids to be playing outdoors multiple times a day. Whereas here in America, 26% of kids don't even get recess anymore. So I think that we have a lot that we can learn from this. And as parents, I think there's a lot that we can advocate for our kids about this. And I think there's a lot that we can think about in our own life too, because especially as Americans, especially as a physician and highly paid, successful academic people, I think that we really are trained to think that like working hard is a sign of dedication. It's like a badge of honor to work 80 hours a week. But truly, it's not necessarily, certainly not the way to health and happiness, but it's also not the best way to be your most productive. Okay, and then he talks about diet and pollution being one of the factors that can contribute to lost focus and poor attention. Food dyes and preservatives. He discusses that in the European Union, there's generally this assumption that something has to be proven safe, just like a drug, before it can be added as an additive to food. Whereas here in the US, because of our laws and everything, things are allowed in food until they're proven unsafe, which is backwards when you think about it. And then environmental toxins. He gives lead as the classic example of how, again, we used to think, a lot of companies wanted us to think it's not so bad to have lead, but there's plenty of data that lead significantly impacts cognitive function and development, especially in developing brains, and increases ADHD risk. And so he thinks that our regulation policies, and I agree, should change to say that we shouldn't be regulating these things after the fact, but making sure that they're safe before we allow them to be introduced. And then again, thinking about circle of concern versus circle of control, what we can do as individuals is really try to eat more whole foods. So picture over here of fruits and vegetables and whole grains, like staying in the periphery of our grocery stores when we shop rather than in the center where everything is packaged and has a shelf life of months to years. That's going to reduce our risk of exposure to things that could be neurotoxic or bad for brain development. There is a 100-fold increase in ADHD diagnosis since the 1980s. I still remember my younger cousin in the 1980s was diagnosed with ADHD, and it was an exceptional thing back then. It was kind of like, oh, he has ADHD. But now I feel like so many people have ADHD. And here, where I practice in Los Angeles, there's also this push in certain communities to have highly, how should I put this? The super zips, the people who are really highly successful and very wealthy, like they have high expectations for their kids, and their kids are in high pressure schools. And so there's pressure on physicians coming from these parents of these teenagers to diagnose their kid with ADHD so that they can get the extra time on the test, and they can get the prescription to help them focus more. Talking to young people who are college students, I know that stimulant use by kids who are not diagnosed with ADHD is extremely prevalent. Young people use Adderall, like my generation used coffee. And so it's something that we really need to be talking to our kids about, because all people will experience an improvement temporarily in their focus with stimulant use. That's why caffeine is one of the most commonly abused substances in the world. But it doesn't mean that everybody has ADHD. And knowing all of these factors like increased stress, chronic exposure to perceived threats, poor nutrition, not enough sleep, all of these things can increase your distractibility and lead you to think that you have ADHD or trauma. But at the same time, that may not really be the whole story. So just because these diagnoses are going up does not mean that truly means the biology that is ADHD, pure ADHD, is going up. It could be all these other things. And truly, the medications have been so much on the rise that we can't even keep up with the demand. There's often shortage of ADHD medications in the last few years because of this increase in diagnosis. He talks also about the confinement of children, meaning kids are not given enough time to just be and to play. Between the increased use of screens and the reduced free time at school, kids have less playtime than they ever had. And play is not something that we should view as optional. It's absolutely essential to kids' development. They learn so much when they're playing. They learn physical skills, they learn social skills, they learn problem-solving skills. They reduce their anxiety by trying new things. And we should really let them be free more. He talks in this book about a woman. I'm sorry, I didn't write down her name for my notes, but she wrote an article. She lived in New York. And in the early 2000s, I think, her 9-year-old said that he wanted to go out in the city and be left somewhere and find his way home. He was in the Boy Scouts and he wanted this adventure. And so she and her husband talked about it, and they were like, I guess he's old enough. He could probably handle that. And so they made a plan. They looked at maps. They talked about the buses. They practiced, ran things, and they left him at a Bloomingdale's. And then they let him find his way back uptown. And an hour later, he came back home and he was just like on top of the world. He felt like he had accomplished something so great. He felt really good about himself. And she thought, oh, this is so great. Yeah, we really should be doing this more. When I think about my own childhood, like I used to do stuff like this all the time. And she was like, I don't really know why we don't do that anymore, but yeah, like we should be doing this more. So she wrote an article in the New York Times about letting her son do this. And she got ripped apart for what the worst mother in the world, who would do that, who would let their kid be out and about. I told my husband about this. We live in Santa Monica. And I was telling him, like, yeah, we should really let our son, who's almost 13, and he's 5'4", he's not a small person. Like, we should let him like walk down the street and go to the Barnes and Noble and shop. And my husband's like, absolutely not. There's some homeless people, some people on drugs out there, like who knows what he would encounter. So again, his brain is still in that survival mode of being like, these are the threats that would be potentially there. But the truth is, our world is safer than it's ever been. Are there sometimes in the city people who are a little altered, maybe yelling, maybe a little out of sorts? Yes. Does that mean that they are necessarily dangerous? No. Does it mean that my son couldn't have the wherewithal and self-awareness to cross the street or get away? No. But still, to my very rational and thoughtful husband, it feels, and I think parents can relate to this, like the idea that you might have made a choice that put your kid in a dangerous situation is so hard to get your brain around because it would feel so bad. You would feel so guilty that you would rather play it safe. But here's the problem with that. When we play it safe, we lead our kids to have what they have now, just ridiculous rates of anxiety, because we're telling them it's not safe for you to go to the Barnes and Noble a block away from our house and buy a book and come home. Or in this case, it's not safe for you to go to the Bloomingdale's in New York and find your way home on a bus or a train in over 30 minutes. Like, you as a 9-year-old, as a 13-year-old are not safe in the world. That's the message that we're sending. So there's a promotion that this woman has tried to make big and viral. It obviously hasn't taken off because I haven't seen any kids doing this, but it's essentially like free range kids. And you can download this little card that you can give your child when you send them out in the world that basically says, I'm not lost. Like, I am exploring the world and I know how to reach my parent if I need to. Just basically let me be a kid. And I think it's great, but I also think it is controversial. And I think even for me and my husband, who are two psychiatrists who want the best for our kids, we can't even come to an agreement about it. We've agreed finally that he can go to the Trader Joe's in our apartment building, which is like in the basement of our apartment building. Feels safer to my husband. And my son actually wants to do that himself. So I think that's a good thing. And I'm not suggesting that you should throw your kids into a dangerous situation, but I do think there are a lot of opportunities where we can help our kids realize that at some point in the future, you are going to be on your own out there in this world, and you're going to need to be ready for that. And the time for them to practice is now. So one other way that I do this with my kids is when we do travel, like if we go to the airport, we think about, okay, how are we going to get there? What do we need to do? So that they're thinking about it, like, okay, we called the Uber. How do you call an Uber? And I'll have them actually do it on my phone. And then when we get to the airport, like, what do we do now? And we go and we like check in and we go through the process of like how you get the code and you put it in there and you get your boarding pass and where's the gate? And they find the gate and we go through. So helping them navigate the world as independent people is important because I know a lot of people whose kids went off to college and the parents, like, on Thanksgiving break, fly to the college to fly their adult child back because their 18-year-old can't navigate flying on an airplane by themselves, which I think is ridiculous and crazy, but it happens. And it happens because we haven't given them enough opportunities. This has been a global trend in our nation. As this woman realized, if you let your kid go out in the city at 9, even if your judgment as a parent is that they are a capable, functional, neurotypical child who can do this, the world is going to eat you up and disagree with you and criticize you. So in Finland and in Scotland, like they let kids play in, I think I read in Scotland, there's a playground where they just have tools and saws and hammers and nails, and that's what the kids play with. And I can't imagine that here. Like we don't even have, everything's almost like padded now. The things that kids would fall off of are gone from playgrounds. So the idea that you would just leave a saw out in a public park for kids to play with is unthinkable. But yet that is how kids learn. It's how they become aware of their bodies, how they learn how to do things, and how they become not afraid. It's also how they learn to regulate one another. And we're really robbing them of that opportunity, which I don't know what that's going to mean 20, 30 years from now when there are the adults running the world. All right, so then there is this idea of attention, and I like this idea a lot. He talked with a professor who described 3 levels of attention as in light form. So like a spotlight is when we're immediately focused on a task at hand in a flow state, like really focused on something. Starlight is more when we're in the default mode network, letting ourselves think about our future and our long-term goals and our aspirations. Daylight is also default mode network when we're in self-awareness and reflection. And then Johann Hari, the author, added stadium lights as another light, which he describes as collective focus for societal change. And it was clear that in his writing of this book and his thinking of everything, this is what he's really most worried about for our future, is that if we don't solve this attention problem, he worries that like our world or society is going to be really negatively impacted because the path that we're on is not great. So the final metaphor is that attention is not this tough thing that can thrive despite neglect. It is more like an orchid where we really need to carefully cultivate it. We need to make sure that when we have electronic devices like cell phones and smartphones, we turn off the notifications, we limit our use, and we need to take breaks from things too. In the book, he actually does a 3-month hiatus from every technology. He leaves his cell phone, his computer, everything with a friend, and he goes to Provincetown, Mass in the Cape, and he stays there for an entire summer. And he talks about the withdrawal that he goes through. And even as a writer who used to read ferociously, like he had found that he could no longer sit and read a book. And it took him like weeks to get to the point that he could read again. But then he started reading and thinking, and he found that he was like a much more creative person after taking this hiatus. But he also realized it's not realistic and it's not sustainable. So now what he does is a 2-month break from social media a couple of times a year. And he lets everyone in his following know, I'm leaving Twitter for 2 months, so that it's a public announcement. And if he goes back on, he would be betraying his word. And that's really important when you think about habits, like letting other people know your intention of what you're going to do significantly increases the chance that you'll follow through on what you're saying you're doing. So I like that he has encouraged that as well. So he gives at the end of the book systemic recommendations. And these are good, but again, this isn't within our circle of control. So it doesn't do much to reduce the anxiety that you and I are feeling after hearing all of this. One is ban surveillance capitalism and business models that profit from manipulating attention. One thing that was so fascinating about this book is, I guess, somehow with Google, you can follow trends of words, things that didn't exist before, like Brexit, and see like how long were they commonly used. And now with the internet, you can see like everything that everybody wrote that included the word Brexit. Like it was never talked about, and then it became a thing, and now it's rarely talked about again. So you can follow these trends of new terms and how long they last. And when you do that with Google and you look at all the data, and you can go back also through digital records of things in print, going back to the late 1800s, you actually see that the time that a new phrase or concept sticks around has progressively been getting shorter since the late 1800s. So it's not just since the onset of the internet and smartphones and everything that this has been happening. The pressure is increasing, like the rate of the short attention span is getting worse, not better, over these last few years since we've had technology, relatively speaking, in that 150-year period or so. But it's been going on for a really long time. So that led him to wonder, why is that? And he talked with this guy who gave him the best idea. And it is basically capitalism. And the idea is actually fascinating to me. So the idea is that with capitalism, you think about companies and how they're successful in growing and how they're judged, especially publicly traded companies where their quarterly earnings they're held accountable to that for shareholders, right? So they have to be earning more if their stock price is going to keep increasing. How do they do that? They either sell more to more people, which you can do to a point. But if you think about something like Coca-Cola, right? Like you can advertise as much as you want, but at some point, everybody who's going to drink Coca-Cola is drinking Coca-Cola. So then what do? If you want your share price to keep going up, you have to sell more to the same people in some new way. So you have to grab people's attention. You have to have Diet Coke, you have to have Coke Zero, you have to have whatever. And so essentially, the theory is that because of capitalism, our attention is getting smaller, which is, again, hopeless feeling because I don't think capitalism is going away. Who knows? Maybe it will. But it just seems that like it was an unlikely connection. It's like in economics, like the guns and butter curve. I just didn't see a connection between like human attention span and capitalism. But reading that and learning about that, I get it. Then he talks about adopting a 4-day work week, which that would create and leave more time for us to engage in deep focus, to spend time doing less, being out in nature, things like that. He has a whole section about rebuilding childhood, which I couldn't agree with more, where we really need to have less focus on homework and school and testing, more time for play and free social activation, and then redesigning technology so that you take things like infinite scroll away. Oh, another thing he talked about, it made me mad, actually. The guy who used to work at Facebook said it would be so easy for these companies to use things like Facebook and Instagram because they have your location to connect you with your actual friends in the real world. But they don't do that. even though they're a social company, it's social media, but it's not actually real life social stuff that they're meant for or that they're intending. What they want is your connection to the device. Because if they connected you with your friends in town or the person who's at a coffee shop next door to your apartment, then you would be spending less time on Facebook. So they don't do that. And he said, but it would be so easy. They could do that in a week. And when he said that, I was like, that's crazy. And that made me mad because that would be great. If I could see where my friends are, get a notification on Facebook, your friend from Chicago is visiting LA today. That would be actually really useful and fun for me. But they don't do that. In ways like that they could redesign technology, they could make us more engaged with one another and reduce our sympathetic nervous system tone, our amygdala tone, and help us have more attention and less activation of our fear responses. But that's just systemic recommendations. The real gold here is what's within our circle of control personally. How can we impact our own focus and attention through changes? And how can we help our kids to have the tools to maintain their own focus and attention? The first is having personal digital boundaries. So, you can use the screen time, notifications and limits on your phone or your iPad. You can turn off notifications. And again, I've done that. They don't make it easy. You have to set aside a good 15 to 30 minutes to turn off all the notifications, but you can do that. Create phone-free zones or tech-free zones. In my house, my kids are not allowed to have any tech in their rooms. We don't have tech at the dinner table. He recommends this thing called a K-Safe, and I had to look it up because I'd never heard of it. Essentially, it looks like a plastic container that I keep like my flour and sugar in. It looks almost like one of those OXO containers, but somehow it has a timer on the top that locks it. And once you put your phone or your device in there for whatever amount of time you set it for, you can't get it out. So it's essentially like a physical barrier to the device, and you can use it for different things. There are focus apps that you can use on your computer or on your phone. And Sung, a physician in a community that I'm in, taught me this. There's a way to go grayscale. It's under the accessibility options on your phone. And I have my phone set up that if I click the button 3 times, the whole screen goes to black and white. And it's much less dopamine inducing in the black and white mode, such that if I go in to check a text, I go in, I check the text, and I leave. Whereas in the color mode, you go to check the text, and next thing you know, you're in the email, and then you're on Instagram or whatever it is. And then remove excess apps. So I have so many apps on my phone, and I haven't actually done this yet because it's going to take me a long time because, again, they don't make it easy to remove those apps. It should just be a matter of click, click, done. Instead, you have to at least maybe there's an easier way, but I have to hold it until it wiggles and then click delete this app, and it takes 4 clicks for each one. But remove the excess apps because, again, the more apps you have on there, the more distractions you're going to get, the more time you're going to spend on your device. Then develop a mind-wandering practice, meaning with intention, plan time in your days, in your weeks to just have time where you're not going to do anything. This is hard for me. Even if I think about going for a walk, I feel like, oh, I should be productive. I should listen to a podcast on my walk or call a friend on my walk. But those things won't let my mind wander. And this is something that he discovered when he was without any devices in Provincetown, Massachusetts for 3 months. He found that he would walk every day on the beach and have all these great ideas that otherwise wouldn't have come to him because he was distracting himself with other things. Then redesign your environment, have dedicated focus areas, remove distracting technology, and finally take action within your community and your family for systemic change within the things that you can control, support attention-friendly policies at your workplace, in your home with your family, and create tech-free community and family events. I think that's it. Okay, so that's it. We're out of time. Thank you, Dashma. Good to see you. And thank you all for being here. This will be a recording in portal.theparentdoctor.com. And for those of you who aren't yet a member, just sign up at theparentdoctor.com/book club. See you next month. Bye.